Also watching what's been playing out is our correspondent in New York, Sherwin Bryce-Pease. And we ask him to join us now via Zoom to give us an update on what this UN Security Council meeting and this particularly what the UN Secretary General had to say after, of course, that visit to Ukraine and Russia, amongst other locations in the midst of this conflict. Sherwin, great to talk to you always. So I suppose a lot of people, UN Security Council in particular, are very keen to hear from the UN Secretary General about his trip, what he found and what he was able to achieve.
Yeah, and for the first time, Peter, we have a small sense of limited success that has been experienced on the ground. We didn't just hear about atrocity crimes. We didn't just hear about the humanitarian needs on the ground. We actually heard about some of the limited success that the United Nations, in coordination with the International Committee of the Red Cross, has had in terms of those humanitarian corridors that allowed for the safe evacuation of hundreds of civilians that have been holed up in the Azovstal steel plant, which has been a real focus of the international community in the city of Mariupol, the city that has been absolutely reduced to rubble by airstrikes and artillery shelling. Some 2,000 Ukrainian soldiers, we understand. We're not sure, though, Peter, this number still holds, right? 2,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been holed up in that plant with thousands of additional civilians. And so slowly but surely the United Nations, this trip by the Secretary General, his frank discussions with both Vladimir Putin of Russia and Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine, really now having the ability to open a small window here in terms of a ceasefire, a localized ceasefire that allows these convoys to go in, buses, trains of buses that go into the steel plant. But remember, you're crossing different lines of control, Peter. So, Stefan Dujarric, his spokesperson, was speaking about just how painstaking it is to move those convoys in and then to safely move them back out. He even talks about how UN staff sometimes have to sleep, on the way there, maybe spend a night or two in different conflict zones before actually being able to verify the people that are coming out of that plant and move them to regions of Ukraine away from the conflict area that are much safer. He also talked about how he had frank discussions about the ripple effects, Peter, of this war, right? He's just returned from a visit to West Africa. He visited Senegal, Niger, and Nigeria. And the focus there was very much on how this situation is impacting food security in the region. He says he talked to both President Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky about this, and he talked about how we need quick and decisive action to ensure a steady flow of food and energy in open markets by lifting export restrictions, allocating surpluses, and reversing and addressing food price increases to calm market volatility. And he says one way of doing that is to get the agricultural production of Ukraine and Russia, which accounts for about 30% of global wheat supply, Peter, is to get that back into the market so that we can calm the volatility we are seeing in terms of food prices, but also, concerns around energy costs, just the transportation of food. You hear from the likes of David Beasley, the executive director of the World Food Programme, that talks about just how the transportation costs as it relates to getting those food supplies into those far-flung areas of Yemen and Syria and Afghanistan, of the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Central African Republic, Mali, the Sahel region. I mean, this is a global impact that this war is having. And so the Secretary General also talking about those ripple effects. And at the end of the day, how this war has to end so that all these, the volatility we are seeing in terms of price increases, which could lead to political stability, how ending this war really is the only and final solution, Peter.
Yeah, but when he went into Russia and Ukraine, he was under no illusion that a national ceasefire was going to happen. And as you say, it really was about a humanitarian story. And listening to Mr. Griffiths, it seems as if progress is being made in terms of the humanitarian situation, even if the human rights aspect, as Ms. Bachelet was talking about, remains a concern.
Yeah, let me break both of those two areas down, right? You talk about the limited progress we are seeing. There are 13 million people that have been displaced by this conflict. That is double the size, more than double the size of the entire population of Johannesburg. So just think about those kinds of, that human traffic on the move in a country which is essentially being reduced to a conflict zone, Peter. 13 million people forced to flee their homes. 7.7 of those internally displaced. More than 5 million have left the country, so they are now refugees. But he did talk about how by the end of May they hope to reach about 1.3 million people with cash assistance, talking about a modicum of respect. When people have lost their livelihoods and their lives and their homes, having cash in your pocket can make you, affirm yourself, your dignity, and be able to make choices for yourselves and your family. So they're putting cash in people's hands. They say over 4 million people to date have been reached with humanitarian aid within the country. But of course, we're talking about 13 million people affected here, over 7 million internally, so not everyone is being reached at this point. And then you also, Peter, touched on the violations of international humanitarian law, the violations of human rights law, which the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, spoke to. She talked about 6,700 casualties, civilian casualties on their count, but that this figure is probably much higher. She talked about arbitrary detentions, possible forced disappearances. She talked about how her staff had met with families that are trying to find their male civilian family members that are searching for these men that have disappeared. They've either been detained, she says, beaten, summarily executed, and in some cases taken to Belarus and Russia, unknown to their families, where they've been held in pre-trial detention. She says her staff, Peter, have heard of cases of women being raped by Russian forces in areas where Russian forces have established their control, but talks about how sexual violence has been perpetrated by both parties to this conflict. And we've been talking a lot in our discussions here on SABC News about how it is always women and children and girls in particular that suffer the brunt of war. In fact, a new UN study, which has been authored by UN Women in partnership with an NGO, came out this week, really talking about how women in particular are being affected by this conflict. I think we have a clip of this, Peter. The Secretary General spokesperson, Stefan Dujarric, speaking to this new report. This is what he had to say. Watch.
A joint report released today by UN Women and the NGO CARE shows that after more than 2 months of war in Ukraine, women and minorities are facing immense hardship when it comes to health, safety, and access to food as a result of the crisis. The report notes that women are increasingly becoming heads of households and leaders in their communities as men are conscripted, yet they remain largely excluded from normal decision-making processes related to the humanitarian effort, peacemaking, and other areas that directly impact their lives. UN Women in Care said that with schools closed, high demand for volunteer work, and the absence of men, women's unpaid care burden has increased significantly. Backtracking on gender equality is already evident on the ongoing crisis. The report warns that the war is increasing unemployment with the entire population and will likely push women into the unprotected informal sectors of the economy and increase poverty.
Yeah, so Peter, Michelle Bachelet also talking about the need for justice and accountability that will be part of any reconciliation and healing process when, if ever, this war does come to an end. And of course, there is a Human Rights Council appointed commission of inquiry that is beginning its work, that will document the crimes, that will gather evidence and compile a report an independent report as to what has transpired in Ukraine. And then you also have the National Prosecutor General in Ukraine that is conducting, and she addressed an ARIA meeting of the Security Council, which is an informal version of the council meeting last week. She talked about how they've opened 8,000 investigations, and those numbers continue to rise. In addition to that, you have the international justice mechanism of the International Criminal Court, by virtue of Ukraine inviting the ICC in to investigate atrocity crimes since the annexation of Crimea in 2014. So the ICC, despite Ukraine not being a party to the Rome Rome Statute. Neither is Russia, but by virtue of Ukraine inviting them and giving them jurisdiction, they are, of course, now conducting an independent forensic investigation of this. Karim Khan, the prosecutor of the ICC, saying they are conducting a painstaking forensic investigation where they are not targeting anybody but following the evidence on the ground. So this is a slow wind, Peter, in terms of justice and accountability. So we're a long way from anyone, sitting in the dark, but that work continues.
And this is quite remarkable, given that the perpetrators, and you indicated some on both sides, know that this evidence is being collected, and yet it doesn't seem to be monitoring their behavior or trying to police their behavior. They seem to be carrying on.
Well, a lot of these countries, look at what the United States did in terms of the ICC's investigation into Afghanistan, right? They sanctioned the prosecutor and members of her staff. She was barred from even traveling to the United States in some instances to come and do her work here at the United Nations, although I think they managed to negotiate a safe passage here and back. But that is some of the pressure that national jurisdictions feel when the eyes of the international community, particularly, this independent court called the International Criminal Court based in The Hague, when they start taking a closer look at some of, pointing figures at some of the crimes or alleged crimes that may or may not have been committed. Ukraine has national jurisdiction here. So, the ICC, let's not forget, is a court of last resort. But given the capacity issues they are now struggling with, the ICC has been invited in. They are now conducting an investigation. But what accountability looks like, given that Russia is not a party to the Rome Statute and essentially rejects the jurisdiction of the court, remains to be seen. You'll also remember, Peter, that the International Court of Justice, the highest UN court, where member states of the United Nations are bound by its decisions at the very beginning of this war, handed down a decision that Russia had violated Ukraine's territory and had to withdraw its troops immediately. That, of course, has been ignored. So the question is not just about jurisdiction and accountability, it's about who's going to enforce the judgments of the ICC, who is going to enforce the judgments of the International Court of Justice, and the UN certainly doesn't have a standing army to be able to do that, Peter.
All right, and perhaps finally, do we have any idea what will happen post this briefing? UN Security Council meets, they get briefed. What happens next?
Peter, you know the answer to that. Nothing. Essentially nothing, because Russia is a veto-wielding member of the Council, right? And so we can bang away about how the UN needs to be reformed. We can bang away about how, this Council is no longer fit for purpose. But it is the only venue we currently have. You even heard President Ramaphosa, point to the UN Security Council that this is essentially a task that they must come to grips with. But in the absence of a Security Council resolution demanding Russia's withdrawal, what council members are seeking to do here, certainly the majority of them, is to continue to put diplomatic pressure on Russia, to expose what they believe to be crimes that are happening on the ground, to put their Russian diplomats in New York under so much pressure that eventually, maybe they'll crack. And so that's what we're seeing, constant pressure, whether in the General Assembly, whether it's, there have been 3 resolutions in the General Assembly, and meeting upon meeting. And I can tell you, with the United States taking over the presidency of the Council this month, expect to hear a lot about Ukraine in open debates in the Council in the month of May.
Sherwin, we're going to leave it there for the time being, but an unfolding story, and one I'm sure you're going to keep on top of for us. Thanks so much indeed for that update.